A trench was not one simple ditch. The Western Front became a network of front lines, support trenches, communication routes, bunkers, medical stations, artillery positions, and supply roads. Soldiers rotated between the front and rear. Most did not spend every day directly facing the enemy. But life near the front remained exhausting. Rain turned earth into mud. Wooden boards helped men walk without sinking, but damaged sections could become dangerous. Rats fed on discarded food and other waste. Lice lived inside uniforms. Water collected at the bottom of trenches, contributing to infections and trench foot. Sleep was constantly interrupted. At dawn and dusk, units prepared for possible attacks. During the night, patrols entered the land between the opposing lines. Repair parties rebuilt wire. Supply groups carried food and ammunition forward. Artillery could begin without warning. A soldier might never see the gun firing at him. He heard the shell approaching, then waited to learn where it would land. This changed the psychological nature of war. In earlier battles, soldiers often saw formations moving toward them. On the Western Front, danger could arrive from beyond the horizon. Men survived one bombardment, and then waited for the next. Medical officers began encountering soldiers who trembled, lost the ability to speak, or appeared unable to control their movements. The condition became known as shell shock. Some officers initially interpreted it as weakness. Over time, the war forced armies to confront the psychological effects of prolonged industrial combat. Yet the front was not constantly chaotic. There were quiet mornings. Soldiers made tea, wrote letters, repaired clothing, and talked about home. Those ordinary moments made the danger more unsettling. A man could be laughing with a friend. Seconds later, everything could change. How long can a human mind live normally inside a place where normality may disappear at any moment? The conflict was called the World War because European empires carried it across the planet. Britain drew soldiers and workers from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Caribbean, and other territories. France mobilized troops from North and West Africa, Indochina, and elsewhere. Germany possessed colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Fighting occurred in places far removed from the original crisis in Serbia. The Ottoman Empire entered the war beside Germany and Austria-Hungary in late 1914. This opened fronts in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Sinai, Palestine, and the Dardanelles. For Britain and France, the Ottoman entry created both a threat and an opportunity. The Ottoman-controlled straits prevented easy Allied access to Russia through the Mediterranean. Allied planners believed that capturing the Dardanelles might knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open a supply route to Russia, and influence neutral Balkan states. In 1915, Allied naval forces attempted to force the straits. The operation failed. Then soldiers landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. British and French troops fought alongside forces from Australia, New Zealand, India, and other parts of the empire. Ottoman defenders held the high ground. The campaign became trapped in its own system of trenches. Heat, cold, insects, limited water, and unsanitary conditions caused enormous suffering. British and Imperial casualties were not limited to combat. Disease removed huge numbers of men from duty. The Allied forces eventually evacuated the peninsula. Italy also entered the war in 1915 on the Allied side, opening a mountainous front against Austria-Hungary. Soldiers fought at high altitude among cliffs, snow, and ice. Battles along the Isonzo River repeatedly gained little territory at enormous cost. That same year, the German army introduced poison gas on a large scale at the Second Battle of Ypres. Gas did not replace bullets and artillery. It became another method of forcing soldiers out of protected positions. Armies developed masks and protective procedures. Then chemists developed new gases. Every defensive measure encouraged another weapon. The war had become an industrial competition in which scientific achievement was measured by how effectively it could disable human beings. The Ottoman government also began mass arrests, deportations, and killings of Armenians in 1915. The destruction of Ottoman Armenian communities became one of the war's greatest crimes and later helped shape the development of the concept of genocide. This was no longer simply a contest between armies. Entire populations were being transformed, displaced, or destroyed. By 1916, military leaders understood that a single brilliant maneuver might not win the war. Instead, they attempted to wear the enemy down. The goal became attrition, destroy more soldiers and resources than the opponent could replace. At Verdun, Germany attacked one of the most important fortified areas in France. The German strategy sought not only to capture ground but to force France into a battle it could not abandon. Verdun became a national symbol. French soldiers moved along a narrow supply route under constant pressure. General Philippe Pétain organized the defense and rotated units through the sector, spreading the burden across much of the French army. The battle lasted for most of 1916. Germany failed to break France. But France paid an enormous price to hold the position, while German losses were similarly severe. To reduce pressure on Verdun, Britain and France launched an offensive along the Somme River on July 1. Before the infantry moved, Allied artillery bombarded German positions for days. Commanders hoped the wire would be cut and the defenders destroyed. When British soldiers climbed from their trenches, many expected little organized resistance. Instead, German troops emerged from deep shelters. Machine guns opened fire. The first day of the Somme became the deadliest day in British military history. Britain suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 killed. By the time the battle ended, more than 1 million men from all sides had been killed, wounded, or captured. The Somme also saw the first use of tanks in battle. The early machines were slow, unreliable, and mechanically fragile. Some broke down before reaching the enemy. But the concept mattered. An armored vehicle might cross wire, protect soldiers from small arms fire, and help restore movement to the battlefield. At sea, Britain and Germany fought the Battle of Jutland from May 31 to June 1. It was the largest naval battle of the war, involving approximately 250 ships and around 100,000 men. Germany inflicted heavier losses, but Britain maintained control of the North Sea and continued its blockade. Verdun did not destroy France. The Somme did not break Germany. Jutland did not eliminate either fleet. After millions of casualties, the strategic situation remained largely unchanged. What happens when nations are losing an entire generation but still cannot imagine accepting defeat? The First World War was not fought only by soldiers. Modern armies consumed ammunition, food, uniforms, fuel, horses, railway equipment, and medical supplies in quantities that no peacetime economy could provide. Governments reorganized entire societies around the conflict. Factories that had produced civilian goods switched to weapons and shells. Women entered industrial workplaces in large numbers, performing jobs previously considered unsuitable for them. Farm production was controlled. Food was rationed. Governments borrowed money and raised taxes. Propaganda encouraged enlistment, sacrifice, and suspicion of the enemy. Newspapers were censored. Letters from soldiers were monitored. The distinction between battlefield and home front began to disappear. Britain's naval blockade limited Germany's ability to import food and raw materials. German submarines attempted to cut Britain's Atlantic supply lines. Civilian ships entered a battle zone where the enemy might be invisible beneath the water. In 1915, the German submarine U-20 sank the British passenger liner Lusitania. Among the victims were 128 Americans. The event created outrage in the United States, although America did not immediately enter the war. Aircraft also changed from tools of observation into weapons. Pilots initially flew above the battlefield to locate enemy positions. Soon they were fighting one another, directing artillery and attacking ground targets. Zeppelins and bombers carried war to cities. For the first time, civilians far behind the lines could hear engines above them and understand that geography no longer guaranteed safety. The war was creating the foundations of modern total war. Factories, civilians, information and economies had become part of the battlefield. When the war began, the United States declared neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson encouraged Americans to remain neutral not only in action but in thought. That was difficult. The United States had cultural, financial, and commercial connections to the Allied powers. American banks provided large loans. American factories sold food and equipment across the Atlantic. But millions of Americans had family connections to Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ireland, and other regions affected by the conflict. Entering the war would divide the country. Germany's submarine campaign changed the calculation. Because Britain depended on imports, German leaders believed unrestricted submarine warfare could force it out of the war before American troops arrived in significant numbers. Beginning in early 1917, German submarines attacked ships approaching Allied ports, including vessels connected to neutral nations. Then British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram. In the message, Germany proposed that if the United States entered the war, Mexico should join Germany. In return, Germany would support Mexican efforts to recover territory lost to the United States. When the message became public, many Americans viewed it as direct evidence of German hostility. Wilson addressed Congress on April 2, 1917. 4 days later, the United States declared war on Germany, ending nearly 3 years of neutrality. Unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram were central to the decision. But declaring war was easier than fighting one. The United States had a relatively small army by European standards. Millions of men had to be registered, selected, trained, equipped, and transported across the Atlantic. American forces would not immediately decide the war. But their arrival changed its mathematics. Germany could calculate how many British, French, and Russian soldiers remained. It could not match the industrial and human resources that America might eventually bring. The clock had started. Could Germany win before the United States became fully involved? Russia had entered the war with an enormous army. But size concealed deep weakness. Russian forces sometimes lacked equipment, ammunition, and effective transportation. Military defeats damaged public confidence. Food shortages and inflation intensified anger at home. By early 1917, Petrograd was filled with unrest. Workers went on strike. Crowds demanded food. Soldiers ordered to restore control began joining the demonstrators. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended. A provisional government took power, but it continued the war. That decision proved disastrous. Russian soldiers were exhausted. Peasants wanted land. Workers wanted food and political change. The government promised reform but could not solve the crisis. In November 1917, October under the Russian calendar then in use, the Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin seized power. They had promised peace. Russia began negotiations with Germany and eventually signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. The terms were severe. Russia gave up control over enormous territories and populations. For Germany, however, the immediate result was more important. The Eastern Front was closed. German divisions could now move west. The Allies had gained the United States. Germany had removed Russia. The war entered 1918 with both sides believing that the coming months offered one final opportunity.